Our first reading this morning comes from Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent had more naked intelligence than any other animal of the field that the sovereign God had made. And it said to the woman, "Indeed, did God say, 'You too shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'From the fruit of any tree in the garden we may eat, though of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, God said, "You too shall not eat, and shall not touch it, lest you too die." Then the serpent said to the woman, "You too will certainly not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you too will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Here ends the reading.
Today we have before us what is likely one of the, if not the, most famous story in the Hebrew Bible. One of the greatest sacred stories of world history, known in every corner of our global context. A story that most of us could tell by heart. A narrative that has shaped the entire Western world in profound and indelible ways, all the way down to our current era. And almost none of you know what this story is about. I need you to accept that this morning, that you don't really know anything about this story, in order for you to be able to hear the story anew today, to really hear this story. So I'm going to help you unlearn the story for a few minutes before we can really approach the story with eyes to see and ears to hear what this Genesis text is saying to us. If I'd performed interviews with some of you as you came in the doors this morning and said, "Today we're reading the Genesis story with Adam and Eve in the garden and the serpent and the tree and the fruit," and I asked you, what would you say this story is about? I imagine many of you would have said something like, it's the story of Adam and Eve's temptation by Satan in the form of a serpent in the garden, and Eve eats the forbidden fruit and thus sins against God, and God punishes them for their evil doing by banishing them from the garden. In a nutshell, it's the story of the fall of humanity. Well, friends, none of that is in the story. Not a single thing. You heard the story read by CJ just a minute ago, and I'm sure you heard most of that in the story. But what you were hearing is the historical layers of interpretation that have been heaped upon this text that invite you to make certain kinds of sense of the story when the story itself doesn't suggest most of those things. Temptation and Satan and sin and the fall and all that. But we'll get there. Let's do a little unlearning here. The first thing that we have to accept is a simple historical fact, that this story was written by men as a patriarchal narrative that blames women for the hardship of illness and laborious toil in a community that knew the difficulty of working the land under often harsh conditions for everyday life. And we can't make any excuses about that. It's simply the fact of the matter. Women had no hand in writing the story, nor formally interpreting it for hundreds and hundreds of years. But when we can see from the get-go that this is a patriarchal narrative that is intended to place the blame on women for the harshness of life, then we can begin to see that the narrative doesn't always succeed in doing that. There are subjugated narratives that puncture the dominant narrative from time to time. If we can really come to the text with fresh eyes, then we have to make another major shift in our approach to this passage. This one is going to be a challenge for you. There is nothing whatsoever in this story about sin or transgression or evil or the fall. Not one thing. Now, do you believe me? It goes against everything that you've heard about this passage from nearly every preacher in every pulpit and every popular rendition of the story, from children's felt boards in Southern Baptist Sunday School to the recapitulation of the narrative in novels and television shows and films. Nevertheless, there is no real concept of the fall in this story. That's a later Christian interpretation of this story. The story of man's fall through woman is Paul's reading of this text in the New Testament, which we can set aside for now if we want to read this text with fresh eyes. In fact, Hebrew has several words for sin and transgression and fall, and not one of these words is found in the story. Nor does the Hebrew Bible ever look back at this story as an explanation for future sins. Not even the prophets like Amos and Isaiah and Malachi and all those who are obsessed by sin, not even the prophets ever hearken back to this story to explain or illuminate sin. Nor is Eve ever really mentioned again beyond chapter 4, and yet she looms large in our imaginations about the origin of evil. Everything from women's bodies to human sexuality to death to the entirety of the ecological web of life has been viewed through the interpretive lens of this story as the story of the fall. Why? Let me tell you about Julian of Eclinum, whom none of you have ever heard of. Don't nod and pretend you know him. You've never heard of him. And about St. Augustine, whom all of you have heard of. Julian of Eclinum disagreed with Augustine about the interpretation of Genesis. Julian believed that mortality, our beingness toward death, was not the result of sin, but of nature itself. A natural part of life. The human's return to the earth in death was part of the human's emergence from the earth in the first place. Adam, ha-Adam, literally earth creature, who was brought forth from the earth. And Julian said death was our return to the earth. It's the natural cycle of things, not a result of sin. And for over 12 years, Augustine and Julian debated human nature and sexual desire and death. Anne Primavesi summarizes their divergence of theological interpretations like this. She says, Augustine held that because of and after original sin, not only humanity, but the natural world as well became subject to disorder. Julian argued that God created fully innocent natures capable of virtue according to their will, not only in paradise, but now as well. Human nature, mortality, the sexual and vulnerable nature of humans, all participates in the wholeness of goodness of the original creation. Augustine, on the other hand, assumed that frustrated desire is universal, infinite, all-consuming. Julian held that sexual desire is innocent, divinely blessed, and once satisfied, entirely finite. Sexual desire for Julian offers us the opportunity to exercise our capacity for moral choice. Julian, by the way, happily married man. Augustine had a shame-inducing sexual encounter that led him to celibacy for the rest of his life. But the church decided, when it came to the body and sexual desire, they'd go with Augustine. So after Augustine's death, the church of the 5th century accepted his views as the orthodox views and rejected Julian's views on the subject as heretical. Do you see how certain readings of a text get sedimented over time such that we don't even need to know the history of their interpretation in order to feel the weight of their inevitability and supposed commonsensical nature? But if this foundational narrative, known the world over, that has so indelibly shaped our lives and our relationships with our gender, our relationships with our sexuality, our relationships with our bodies, our relationships with death, our relationships in connection to the wider web of life, is not in fact about sin and humanity's and nature's fall into disorder and our all-consuming frustrations of desire, then what could it be about? Let me tell the story again with just a little commentary to point out things that we might miss as they are overtaken by the weight of the historical reading of this text. We start after creation with the man and the woman, who is not yet Eve, and that's very important. They are in the garden, living in the presence of God. And now God told the man in the garden, "You shall not eat the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it or you will die." But the serpent, notice Will Gaffney's translation of this text, the serpent, most intelligent of the creatures, not the most crafty. That makes it sound pretty evil. But no, the serpent, the most intelligent of the creatures, came to Eve, not Adam, said to the woman, "You too will certainly not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you too will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now, it's important to note here that the woman does not yet know good and evil. Making any interpretation of this act as sin, nonsense. How can one sin if one does not know good or evil? Sin is not in this text. If you don't know good and evil, you cannot sin. All she knows is that God had told them not to eat the fruit of the tree or they would die. Not that eating is bad, never said that, or that death is bad, it never said that. Just a simple action and consequence statement. Don't eat of the tree or you will die. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate too. Now, if you're reading this within the context of the entire Hebrew Bible, it's important to note that wisdom, the very thing that the fruit was promised to provide, is lauded throughout the tradition. From Solomon all the way up to Jesus himself, wisdom is to be desired, sought after. And what the woman does here is desire wisdom, which every man after her was praised for desiring. There is no indication that this desire for wisdom is bad or sinful, but rather laudable. So they eat the fruit together. And the serpent was right. They ate it, and they did not die. So we're left with the question that we don't ask if we accept the dominant interpretation of the text, but we're ignoring the questions that the text itself invites us to ask. Did the serpent know something that God did not know? Remember, the serpent is not Satan here. There's nothing about this text that suggests that. That's a later interpretation of this text. The serpent is the most intelligent of the creatures in the garden. Did the serpent know something that God did not know about this tree and this fruit? Or was God lying about death as a result of eating the fruit? At very least, isn't the serpent telling them the truth in this story? Did the humans have good reason to wonder if they were being deceived? And if so, by whom? They ate it, and they did not die. And just so you're clear that this is not about their eventual deaths, God says in verse 22 that the humans needed to be removed from the garden lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. So immortality was never in view here. The understanding was they would eat it and they would drop dead. And they did not. Rather, they became a little more like God, knowing good and evil and gaining wisdom. Now let's go a little beyond this morning's text to get a bit of a fuller picture. After the man and the woman do not die and are banished from the garden, then the woman is given the name Eve, which means mother of all the living. Not only did she not die, but after she eats the fruit and gains wisdom and leaves the garden, she is not only not consigned to death, she is named mother of all life. Now, in our typical readings of the story and of the Bible as a whole, we usually assume that whatever God does is unquestionably good. But sometimes we're invited by the text to question God and God's actions too. So don't be afraid. Be a little more like Eve here. God banishes them from the garden and does seem perturbed in the process, that's for sure. But here's the important question that often gets left out in our reading of this text as a text of temptation and sin and the fall and the banishment from the goodness of the garden. Don't miss this detail. God goes with them. Have you ever considered that part of the story? Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Edenic garden, but God does not leave them. None of the rest of Genesis or the entire Hebrew Bible, for that matter, would make any sense if God stayed in the paradise of the garden and banished humanity to lives of separation from the divine. God is there with humanity and the rest of the ecological web of life the whole entire time. In fact, before God removes them from the garden, before God drives them out and places an angel with a flaming sword at the path, God makes clothes for them. The tender motherly act of a seamstress sewing garments for her children who are going out into the world. And then God follows them down the path, out of the garden, watching all along the way, showing up again in chapter 4. So we might ask of God in this text, is God maturing as a parent in this story? We've been told to think of God as static and unchanging, but the text does not invite that. Is God maturing as a parent in the story? A parent who once controlled Adam and Eve by directives to keep them safe and secure in the garden, but now a parent who must respond to a child's developing sense of agency and knowledge and wisdom and choice. Is God, a new creator at this point in the story, being shaped in relationship with the creation? A parent who says, "Get out," when the child disappoints, but who can't bear to let them go and follows them the whole way. And when we get to chapter 4, Adam and Eve conceive their first child, Cain, which Eve says that she has produced with the help of God, not Adam, notably. She has become a co-creator with God after she leaves the garden, after eating the fruit, after gaining wisdom, after the banishment from Eden. She becomes the mother of all living. And then she gives birth to Abel. And only then, in chapter 4, not chapter 3. In chapter 4, verse 7, does sin enter the story. And it is presented thusly: a choice between life and well-being for another creature, or death and violence against one's fellow creature. And Cain chooses the sin of death and violence against his brother Abel. And that is the origin of sin in this narrative. Not eating the fruit. And it's been right there all along, and we've been unable to recognize it. Sin enters the narrative when one creature kills another creature. Yet that, to our great detriment, did not become our foundational story of sin. So what is this story about, if not about the serpent's temptation and Eve's sin and the fall of humanity and all of nature into chaos and disorder? Well, I don't know. I don't think there is a singular answer to that question. And Prima Facie suggests, above all, it is a story of what it means to be human, of what human nature is capable of, both positively and negatively. The story is meant to ask questions of us and invites us to ask questions about our lives in the world. And if that is the case, perhaps one question the story asks of us is this: will you do the hard thing that you know comes with troublesome insight and difficult choices between good and evil, and that requires great struggle and agency? Like Eve, who knew the consequences of her choice, which wasn't a choice between good and bad, but a choice between wisdom and innocence. Or will you choose the easy way of very little agency, very little expected of you, letting someone else make the hard choices for you, averting your eyes from the things of the world that would cause you to have to choose and act and face up to the consequences? And if you need help making that decision between the hard way of wisdom and struggle and freedom, or the easy way of obedience and acquiescence and deference, then don't go to Adam or the Apostle Paul or Saint Augustine. Go straight to the source. Go to Eve, mother of all living, co-creator with God, who has taken the scorn of the whole world for the choice that she made. Yet she did not die, and neither will you.